I think it was Liberia off the top of my head. There was some sort of war that was triggered because Liberia wasn't paying its debts. Several wars in history have been started over debt repayments. Famously, the Mustache Man. Do you remember the World War I reparations? He said, "No, we're not going to play it.
Yep.
What are you going to do now? You and whose army?" Right?
I would also
and that led to World War II, right? That led literally one of the factors that led to World War II was Germany welshing on its World War I debt repayments. Now, in the American case, okay, let's just pretend it's like, well, it still comes down to you and whose army. And as long as America has the biggest army by some distance and is the impenetrable fortress, blah, 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 what is China going to just like invade and like who? How is anybody going to recover their debts from America?
You just put your finger on the key issue.
Yeah,
I mean that is the issue. It's ultimately this comes down to geopolitical and military considerations. As we just talked about a few moments ago, the U.S. military is dependent, cannot operate without the U.S. Chinese supply chains. You know, that 2018 report highlighted the US military breaks at hundreds of separate points, if not supplied by China. And we are literally in the process at this very moment of watching the US lose a war against Russia because Russia can outproduce the US when it comes to the key munitions and stuff like that. So your point about, you know, the US has the dollar and it has this exorbitant privilege. We cannot assume that is going to be persistent forever because that privilege is a function of the US military. And the US military is being undermined because it doesn't have the ability for it to produce its own supply chains in a whole number of key cases. There is one Chinese shipyard that has outputted more commercial ships in 1 year than the US has in the entire period since World War II. Now, yes, it's producing commercial ships at the moment, but that same logic could apply to military ships. The Chinese are building a military which is designed to do one purpose, because they do not go around the world bombing people because they're not having enough bum sex or whatever it is that the US military is up to these days. The US is building so the Chinese are building their military for one purpose, and that's to defeat the US. They have the advantage on the manufacturing, and the US military is dependent on Chinese supply chains. So you've absolutely put your finger on the absolute heart of this issue. Yes, it is vital that the US does not lose its military significance, and it will lose its military significance if it cannot supply its own military through its manufacturing efforts. And then all of that dollar stuff that you're talking about goes away once the military advantage goes away.
So just to recap what you've said, Americans need to be worse off in the short term in order to ensure that their military can still be supported.
I'm saying that Trump should not care if the cost of Nikes and coffee goes up a bit, if the advantages that he gains from this border policy is to ensure that the US military is viable, which means that US dominance, or at least a top seat in a emerging multipolar world, is not put at risk. And at the moment, it is at risk.
Carry on.
Okay, so we kind of
cigars are not cheap, by the way, Victoria. They're really bloody expensive. Anyway, carry on.
we kind of leapt onto some of the military points I was going to come to later, but I started off making the point. Okay, the US has a huge amount of debt that it needs to roll over in the next 12 months. It's about 10 trillions worth, and if it rolls it all over at these new higher rates, you might as well not bother with Doge, because, you know, rolling it over, moving it from, you know, whatever it was, let's call it 1%. Let's say that goes up to 5%. You're looking at something like 400 billion of extra cost going on the US P&L. They're already spending 1 trillion a year. The last thing they need is to be spending 1.4 trillion, because it just wipes out any other methods that the US has. What the US has got to do is to get its cost of refinancing its debt below its nominal growth rate. Now, why is this important? Because the US is currently at the point where its economy, its GDP, is roughly the same size as its debt pile. So they roughly match at the moment. Now that's very neat and handy for us for the following calculation: which one of those two is growing faster? Because if the debt is growing faster than the GDP, the debt eventually swallows everything. They go into a debt spiral. If the GDP is growing faster, then the debt becomes manageable. It's still a significant problem. It's been allowed to get to that point, but at least it becomes manageable. So the US has got to get itself in a position over the course, quite quickly actually, over the course of the next year, where it can refinance that debt at a viable cost. And that's part of what this is doing. Now, why does a readjustment matter here? What's important? Well, the important factor is that the dollar needs to come down. The dollar is too strong. The dollar is a wrecking ball. It's something that the macro people have been talking about for a long time. I mentioned earlier that if the dollar dies, it will be a result of its strength and not its weakness. Now, what do I mean by this? About 50% of global debts are denominated in dollars. So there is a constant perennial need for there to be dollars in the system in order to refinance these debts. The second aspect of that is that if the dollar is strong, and the dollar has been very, very strong over the course of the last few years, it raises the effective refinancing cost of the world's debt. So if they can get the dollar down, and I tend to measure this by looking at the DXY, which is a basket of the dollar against a whole basket of other currencies. If they can get that down, what it does is it eases financial conditions across the rest of the world, allowing them to refinance their debt, allowing global liquidity to increase. You need global liquidity to increase. China especially needs this at the moment because the Chinese debt cycle is a little bit further ahead. They need to get the dollar down because otherwise they can't refinance their debt. Once they start to refinance their debt, that unlocks the business cycle for them and unlocks further financial easing for them. Global liquidity starts to raise. That puts the US in a position where they are able to refinance their significant proportions of debts as well. So in the short term, the big thing that they needed, which was a weaker dollar, that has already been achieved at this point, and hopefully that will continue to go down. So I think my third point was something like China needs a readjustment that will give them a surge in global liquidity. That's what I was talking about there. Feel free if you want to jump in before I move on.
I do have a quick question about all of this. Is that, okay, all of this might make sense if Trump and the US government were the only actors here. But this is there's a very complex global financial system, trading system connected, which has knock-on consequences to all of this.
Don't assume that they are opposed on that one.
But what I have observed, Dan, is that a lot of other economic blocks, let's just say the EU was one very prominent example, China is another example, are being quite belligerent. They're saying, actually, we're gonna be retaliatory. We're not gonna back down. We're gonna meet you. And there's even talk within Europe. I listened to all these Rory Stewarts and so on. They were all saying, at what point do the European nations say, actually, fuck America, it's a basket case. China's the safer bet right now. America's going down, China's going up. Let's just everybody just side with the Chinese at this point. Leave America do what it wants, basically. If it wants to blow up the entire world's financial system, it can blow itself up, and we will just go in because China currently has a manufacturing capacity, etc., etc. That's one scenario. Another scenario is, what if the short-term pain that people are talking about is so intense that it actually just leads to a global financial collapse, or just blows up the world economy, which some people have talked about, in which case the devastation may be big enough that all of this stuff we're talking about is moot. Because if the entire global economy blows up, how are you gonna do anything? Forget about refinancing debt. Are you going to pay for anything?
The thing that I would urge people is don't judge this stuff by the hyperbolic headlines. I understand that there's a lot of posturing going on. I mentioned this earlier that both Trump and Xi are going to do their strongman thing where they take a pop at each other in public. I can tell you absolutely, the world around, they all understand that the dollar needs to come down because as I mentioned, 50% of global debts are denominated in dollars. The Chinese, they need the dollar down. The US, they need the dollar strength down. So don't get caught up in what they're saying and the spin that the headlines are putting on it. They are all aligned when it comes to this aspect of driving down the DXY. So I don't think anything that I've said in the first 3 points is particularly significant. I'm just making the point that this is a prime goal. We know it's prime goal because Scott Bessent has been talking about this for years, and the entire macro community has been talking about the dollar wrecking ball for years. Scott Bessent was a global macro hedge fund manager. He actually originally worked for George Soros. In fact, it was pretty much his idea to do the ERM trade that got the Black Wednesday trade, or the Liberation Day, was the original Liberation Day trade. That was actually Scott Bessent's idea, and he took it to his boss George Soros. And the contribution that George Soros made is that when he asked Scott, how much do you want to do on this, he said 100% of the fund, and Soros said, why not 300% of the fund? Now, yes, I know that Soros, bit of a diversion here. I know Soros is a literal demon these days, but him and his team are bloody good when it comes to the finance. They are absolute macro killers on that stuff. So Scott knows what he's talking about. Him and the rest of the macro community has been talking about getting this dollar down for a long time. Now they're doing it. The world is aligned. Don't get caught up on the fact that there's a lot of posturing in public.
So to be clear, Dan, it's all about China, but China's also on board with all of this.
So there are different aspects of this. So the first part that I'm talking about is the need to get the dollar down. That is a significant part of what this is trying to achieve. Because look, what monetary tools have you got? You've got interest rates, and that's basically all Western economies have been using for about the last 20 years. We're just going to lower interest rates one more time, or maybe we've raised them a bit here. They've basically got one lever and they pull it up and down, normally down. Are you going to get yourself out of your current situation by lowering interest rates? Well, no, you can't, because inflation is, a hair's breadth from coming back, and probably will if you lower inflation. Can you raise interest rates? Well, no, because the debt costs are already unviable. So you've got one lever and it doesn't work. You need a second mechanism, and this is what this is providing. It's a second mechanism. So, is everybody aligned on the need to get a lower dollar? Yes, and that is part of what this policy addresses. So on this aspect, there isn't going to be any pushback because people are happy with it, and this policy has already achieved a very fundamental and very important aspect of what it was trying to achieve.